So the ruling essentially is that I have to take social media retraining with a social media expert. And I'd like to make it very clear, there is no such thing as, there's no profession.
Yeah, it's like the Wizard of Oz. Like, who is it going to be? Do you know the expert?
No, I don't.
That's crazy.
No, I've got a couple of names, but I don't even know what defines you as a social media expert, and neither does the college, and they don't care. You know, if someone presents themselves as a social media expert, that's good enough. My sense is that if you're a social media expert, you have a podcast with millions of followers and you're doing just fine on your own, and you actually don't need to work for an idiot bureaucracy. But, you know, that's just me.
Right.
So now, not only do I have to be re-educated by this social media expert, but I have to do it at my own expense, which, you know, is neither here nor there in some sense, but for an indefinite period of time.
Wow.
Until I've learned whatever the hell lesson I'm supposed to learn, and I don't exactly know what lesson that is, by their judgment, right? And so
it's all up to them. So it's kind of this vague thing
them.
that they've put you into, and they challenged you because they were upset at things you had said on Twitter.
Mostly on
online.
Twitter. No, well,
okay.
They also, and maybe maybe this can happen today. Somebody submitted the entire transcript of my last conversation with Joe Rogan as a complaint, partly because of what I said about climate change. Now, I am not a fan of climate change models, which I think are, to call them flawed is to barely scrape the surface.
So do you feel like, but they're challenging your things you've said on social media, right?
Yeah, well.
So do you think it's a challenge of your free speech? Is that what you feel like?
Oh, the court that ruled against my appeal essentially said that it was a free speech issue.
Okay.
And they said in their opening argument that according to the Canadian Charter of Rights, which was, by the way, instantiated by Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, and Justin's regime is in the process of absolutely gutting it. Anyways, I have a right to free speech according to that charter, but, and that's the next sentence, this very low-level bureaucratic institution has the right to abridge that essentially as they see fit, which means, as far as I can tell, that I don't have the right to free speech at all. And I should make very clear, those colleges should be intervening when a client or a patient, right, or a customer, depending on the regulated profession, has been mistreated in some manner by the person they're dealing with. Okay, the people that levied complaints against me, first of all, most of them don't live in Canada. Second of all, none of them were clients of mine. Third, none of them knew anyone who was a client of mine. They claimed harm, that I had done harm, on behalf of other people who they also didn't know. They also, a number of them also claimed to be clients of mine in writing in the complaint
forms.
Not. No, they're not clients of mine. And clients of mine, before I became politically known, let's say, I practiced as a clinician for more than 20 years, and I had zero complaints, and I had zero complaints levied against me at the university too, either at Harvard or at the University of Toronto. And the reason for that was that I treated my students, my colleagues, my co-workers, and my clients well all the time. There was zero problems. But as soon as things exploded around me politically, well, the people who've weaponized the colleges have taken that opportunity to go after me. And then the college, which is nicely infested by radicals, like almost everything else in the West, and particularly in Canada, are using this opportunity to attempt to make my life miserable. But we'll see whose lives are made miserable.
Wow.
This is how it begins. When individuals join a regulated profession, they do not lose their charter right to freedom of expression. At the same time, however, they take on obligations and must abide by the rules of their regulatory body that may limit their freedom of expression. That's just one sentence after another. That's how it starts.
Yeah, perfect. It's a great thing to highlight, you know. It's, well, you have this fundamental right, but what? What rules? There's a rule, eh? There's a rule, is that right? That the College of Psychologists has, that I can't criticize Justin Trudeau on Twitter. That's a rule, is it? And if someone anywhere in the world complains about the fact that I've criticized Justin Trudeau, let's say, that all of a sudden that's a rule, even though it wasn't a rule. And of course I get to criticize Justin Trudeau, not only because he richly deserves it in every way you can possibly imagine, but because that's actually what freedom of speech means.
This is how it begins.
There's part of me that's thinking, well, look, Peterson, the College of Psychologists is after you. You've taken it to court. Now the judges have decided that you're wrong. Maybe you're wrong. And I think, well, I expressed political sentiment, and I'm actually informed. For the life of me, I can't see how I'm wrong. I think I have a responsibility to say what I think, and I think many people agree with that, and I think the fundamental consequence of that around the world has been massively beneficial to people. So I think, number one, what the hell? And number two, bring it on. There's part of me that's thinking, if you saw renewed, I did some investigation into the derivation of the American public education system and found out that it was based on the Prussian model. And the Prussians produced a universal education system in the late 1800s because they were afraid they were losing military superiority, and they wanted to produce a cadre of mindless, obedient soldiers. That was expressly the purpose. And then that model was adopted by prototypical fascists in the US, again in the late 1800s, this is before Mussolini and all of that time, corporate types mostly, who wanted to produce cadres of obedient workers. And that's why the desks are in rows, and that's why there's factory bells, and that's why it's top-down leadership. What was really stunning about that wasn't only that that was the model, but it's worse than that, because the people who built the schools were consciously aiming at eradicating the will of the students who were part of the system because they wanted them to be obedient. I've seen the climate apocalypse use fear to induce something approximating the same kind of level of tyranny, as far as I'm concerned, that characterized the vaccine lockdown. Help me sort that out and understand where you stand.
I see these huge levels of depression and despair, loneliness in kids, and I don't think that there's a single cause to it. And I think blaming it on, depression about climate is probably oversimplistic. And in fact, I think a lot of the problems we see in kids, and particularly boys, it's probably underappreciated that how much of that is coming from chemical exposures, including a lot of the sexual dysphoria that we're seeing. They're swimming through a soup of toxic chemicals today, and many of those are endocrine disruptors.
I've seen the emptiness in your life isn't because you don't have enough rights. You have all the rights there are. You have more than you should. And it isn't because you lack consumerist options. You have Amazon and pornography, man. You can get whatever you want whenever you want it. And if that's still not working, well, what are you missing? Well, maybe you're missing the opposite of that. A little bit of restraint, a little bit of sacrifice, some responsibility. The emptiness in your life isn't because you don't have enough.
If you're a person who's in the doing 0 exercise per week camp, the very good news is the benefit you get from going from 0 to 3 hours a week is a greater benefit than anyone gets along the exercise curve. Taking someone who's at 5 hours and taking them to 15 will produce less relative benefit than going from 0 to 3. So in other words, I want that person to see some real incentive for making this change. Secondly, I'll put some numbers to it, right? So going from no exercise to 3 hours a week approximately reduces your all-cause mortality, that is to say death by every cause, by 50% at any moment in time. So if you're standing there asking, what's the probability I'm going to die this year? Well, we can sort of actuarially figure that out. You get to cut that number in half by simply going from 0 to 3 hours to exercise a week if you're a non-exerciser. If you're a person who's in the doing 0.
If you're a sensible thinker and you're a critical thinker, you should subject your own thoughts to the most intense critical analysis possible, knowing that if you put forward second-rate thoughts, you'll act them out, and that will cause you no end of grief. And partly what we're supposed to do in university is teach people to subject their own thoughts to a multiplicity of critical perspectives so that there's nothing left but wheat, right? So the chaff disappears. If you're a
to say that men are stronger, to say that men are faster, taller, whatever, that's not to say that women are inferior. That's not to say that we're not capable of amazing things and we're not strong and we're not, again, all of those words I previously mentioned, but we have different physical ceilings. I believe we deserve to be celebrated on our uniqueness. That's what makes the women's sporting category special. And there are still phenoms in women's sports, just like there are male sports. Look at Venus and Serena Williams. While by no means could they compete with the best male tennis player, they're phenomenal. To say that men are stronger, to say that men are faster, taller, whatever.
Inflation.
The Victorian era was characterized by the generation of a substantive amount of wealth. And one could argue that part of what was happening on the Victorian beauty front was the advertisement by aristocrats that they could tolerate this encumbrance in the name of beauty because they had the financial resources to sustain it. You know, there's an example of that biologically would be, in principle, would be the peacock's tail, which is extraordinarily beautiful, but also quite the encumbrance. And apparently part of what it signifies, especially if it's girls who don't have a father, will hit puberty on average at least a year earlier, which is substantially earlier. And that indicates a real biological impact of the lack of a masculine figure in the household, because that's a walloping physiological difference. We know that boys who have lack of father at the age of 12 have telomeres, so this is a genetic difference, that are on average something approximating 15% shorter, which means that all other things being equal, they're already doomed to a much shorter life. And so we don't know what the pervasive multi-generational consequences of the breakdown in familial structure in the final analysis are.